We're here today to do the asbestos awareness seminar that AHERA requires for maintenance and custodial people that are involved in doing work in schools where they are not actually performing asbestos abatement work themselves. My name is Dan Cooper. I'm with Microanalytics, and I'll be giving the presentation today, and it'll be accompanied with a PowerPoint presentation so you guys will be able to kind of follow along and see what you see. The main things that we're going to talk about, first of all, we're going to discuss what asbestos is. We're going to talk some about what the health effects of asbestos are and how your body has natural mechanisms to try to prevent disease, including asbestos. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the various asbestos rules and regulations, what standards apply. We're going to talk some again about where asbestos is found, both in general and then give you some specific guidelines to where you might be able to find out where asbestos actually is located in your facility in school. Then we're going to discuss how to recognize damaged ACBM, because that is where we find that there is the highest potential risk for exposure to individuals, and so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to recognize a damaged asbestos material. We'll talk some finally about what are the proper housekeeping activities, what are the things that we want to do in order to make sure that we don't put ourselves at risk and create dangerous situations related to asbestos while we're going through our normal day-to-day activities. So let's begin with what asbestos is. Asbestos is a mineral fiber. It's found most frequently in mines. It's very similar to talcum powder or coal. It's usually mined, and it comes out of the mine as rock, and then it's typically processed in a processing facility where it actually takes this rock or this mineral and turns it into a usable building material. One of the most significant things about asbestos that creates the opportunity for it to cause diseases is that it is a crystalline structure. In other words, the building blocks for asbestos are little bitty pieces of materials that build on top of each other and on top of each other, so that it can be continuously broken down into small little pieces of itself that look exactly like itself, and ultimately these pieces can get small enough to where they can actually be inhaled through your nose and into your lungs. This is a little bit different than fiberglass. When you're dealing with fiberglass, fiberglass has a finite diameter that it cannot get smaller than, just because of the way it's extruded and manufactured. So the asbestos creates a much more significant potential health risk than fiberglass would be. Asbestos is mostly dangerous when it gets into very small pieces, because we need to get the pieces down to chunks that are small enough for us to breathe. It's very similar, like I said earlier, like coal or talcum powder. In fact, it's found very frequently in conjunction with talcum powder, and it's these fine small particles that ultimately can do the damage in your lungs. So what are the different kinds of asbestos? There is a number of different types of asbestos. There's probably 8 or 9 different kinds of asbestos that actually exist in the universe or in the world, and the ones that we are most concerned about from the standpoint of adverse health effects, and the ones that are regulated, are actually the materials that are found in fibrous forms when they occur in nature. Fibrous means basically it's something that's longer than it is wide. If you think of maybe a needle would be an example of something that looks like a fiber. It's 3, 4, 5, 100 times longer than it is wide. They're usually really long and really thin. The most common type of asbestos that's found in the United States is a fibrous form of asbestos that's known as chrysotile. Chrysotile is usually a real white, fluffy type material. It's used a lot in insulating materials. It's found in a lot of other types of building materials as well, such as ceiling tiles, floor tiles, mastics. We'll get into some of those specific uses a little bit later. But the most common type, like I said, is chrysotile. It's about 90% of the total asbestos that's used in the building industry in the United States is comprised of this chrysotile asbestos. If there is any good news associated with asbestos, this is probably it. There are a number of countries that don't even regulate chrysotile. A lot of the European countries, they don't believe that this type of material is as dangerous of an asbestos-formed material as some of the others, and as such, they don't normally regulate it. If you think of the angel hair that you see sometimes on top of mangers, if you're a Christian and you put a manger up at Christmas time, this angel hair, this fluffy stuff that looks a little bit like cotton, is typically the type of formulation of asbestos that you find is chrysotile. I guess the second most common type of asbestos that you find in the United States is an asbestos that is called amosite. Amosite is also identified by a lot of people as brown asbestos. It's commonly called brown asbestos, and it's a much more rigid type of asbestos. We talked a little bit earlier about there being a consideration of a fiber being something that looks like a needle. Well, if you look at asbestos fibers for amosite underneath the microscope, they actually do look like little bitty needles. They typically are not susceptible to water wetting them, but as chrysotile more frequently has an affinity for water, as the other forms of asbestos, including amosite, tends to fend the water off because of its chemical configuration. I guess the third and least common type of asbestos that you find used, at least in the United States, is a fibrous form of asbestos that's known as chrysotile. Chrysotile, is known as blue asbestos because it actually is dark blue in color. It's very similar in terms of its chemical structure and physical appearance to amosite, in that it's very rigid, it's very needle-like, it isn't amphibole, and it doesn't like to be wetted as well as amosite. So these are the main types of asbestos that we find most commonly in the United States. There's chrysotile, where about 90% of the materials that have asbestos in them contain this chrysotile. Amosite is the next most common. It's a very rigid type of asbestos, and that comprises a little bit more than 5% of the uses of asbestos in the United States. And then you have chrysotile, which maybe that's 1–2%, and all of the other forms of asbestos compiled add up to make the other balance between that 98% and 100%. So what do they do with this material? What's the value of asbestos? It's been used for thousands of years as a material because of its tensile strength, its rigidity, its durability. But why did they use it in the building materials that we're finding in the United States? Well, one of the most common uses of it is it's a very good insulator. It doesn't conduct heat, and it doesn't conduct electricity. So from the standpoint of it not conducting heat, it's used a lot of time on insulations that you'll find on pipes, insulations that you might find on boilers or hot water heaters. You might find it as insulation on electrical wiring. A lot of the old wiring that was used in theaters, the outer lining of the electrical wiring had chrysotile asbestos as the external jacket, just because it didn't conduct heat and it didn't conduct electricity. Another property, like I said, is it's very heat resistant. So another common application for asbestos, it can be found a lot of times in applied fireproofing, a lot of times in buildings where you have a metal or a steel deck. The fire code of the time, if the building was constructed in the middle to late 70s, the fire code called for a fireproof material to be actually sprayed upon the beams, and the reason that this was applied was to prevent the spread of heat and fire if a portion of the building would catch on fire. So that a lot of the mixtures that were used for this fireproofing at that time, one of its components was asbestos. It's typically chrysotile or andesite asbestos. You'll also find asbestos in a number of the ceiling tiles. A lot of buildings, including schools and churches, have either lay-in ceiling tiles that are installed from a suspended grid, or ceiling tiles that are either attached to each other in a process that's called spline, or else glued to a ceiling above. Some of these actual ceiling tiles that are in fire-rated areas have been identified as asbestos containing. It's a very durable material as well. In addition to its properties with respect to heat transfer, it's very, very durable and it lasts a really long time. So it was put into some building materials in order to give them added strength and rigidity. Examples of this would be floor tile. A lot of the early on floor tiles were a mixture of asphalt and asbestos. The asbestos was put in there sort of as a binder to hold the actual materials together, and it was also put there to prevent the material, the floor tiles themselves, from deteriorating over time. That's another use for asbestos in ceiling tiles. We talked about it in fire-rated ceiling tiles because of its ability to prevent the spread of heat. Well, because of its tensile strength and its ability to bind, it also can be found in a number of different lay-in ceiling tiles and attached ceiling tiles, simply from the standpoint of holding the rest of the material together. Another place where you'll find it, which I really am not certain why it's in these materials, but it's very, very common for it to be found in these materials, are in certain glues and mastics. It's very, very common to find asbestos as a substantial component of the glue that is applied to a surface before you put a floor tile down. Typically there are 2 or 3 different colors of this mastic, and you can't always tell by the color of the glue, but just because of the colors versus construction dates, typically you'll find black tars and mastics that actually contain anywhere from 5 to 20% chrysotile asbestos. Some of the acoustic ceilings that you find in schools and other buildings are actually 12-inch tiles that have been glued to a surface like we talked about earlier. Well, not only can you find asbestos in the tiles themselves, but also in the glue that is used to adhere the tile to the surface above. So that normally on a 12-inch ceiling tile you'll see maybe 4 glue dots, is what we call them, that are maybe 2 inches, 3 inches in diameter, usually 1 on each corner of the actual ceiling tile. And these glue dots have a tendency in the earlier types of glue that was used for adhering the ceiling tiles to also contain chrysotile asbestos. Let's talk about some fairly common terms that we can find when we're in conversations about asbestos. And some of these materials are materials that I'm sure you will have seen in some of your facilities, but not really understood the term. The first one that I'd like to talk about is a material that's called aerosol. Aerosol is a name that's given to a specific type of asbestos insulation that usually is found on cold water lines or warm water lines where you're not dealing with high temperature and pressure. And the reason that this is a significant type of asbestos containing material is because it doesn't look like asbestos at all. If you look at a cross section of a cardboard box where you see the pieces of cardboard going in and out of the structure of the material, aerosol insulation looks very similar to that. However, it's a combination of cellulose, paper, and asbestos that are woven together, and the term aerosol comes from the terminology of the actual insulating properties of the material is from the air cells or the spaces that are in the material. So it looks very much like a corrugated box, and early on a lot of people misidentified this as a non-asbestos material simply based upon its physical appearance. But when you have this type of material and it's associated with a heating system or a water system, virtually 100% of the time upon analysis you will discover that that actual aerosol does contain asbestos. There's another term that's used a lot that's called mag. Mag is a white material. It does look a lot like talcum powder, but it's usually very white. It tends to be very fluffy. On pipe insulation and on pipe elbows, it usually appears pretty hard, But when you break it off, there are very thin-like fibers or hair-like projections that run through it. The actual powder, the dust, is an inert material. It's usually a calcium carbonate or a hydroxide form. And the actual asbestos that's in mag is actually these hair-like projections, or this fibrous web of material that actually holds it together. So if you see that, there is a good indication that you could have asbestos there. Not all material that looks like mag is asbestos, but a good percentage of the materials are, if in fact they are constructed at an earlier date. I have two more terms that I want to talk about briefly. The first one is called spray-on. You'll hear people talk about spray-on, where this is the acoustic material that we talked about earlier, where you may find it on structured steel, where it's actually spray applied, or sometimes it's applied to a ceiling or a decorative around the sides of a wall or something like that. Well, it's actually sprayed or troweled on. A lot of times this material contains asbestos as well. The final term I want to talk about is a term that is called blue mud. A lot of times when you look at piping systems and their insulation, the actual main runs, the 3-foot sections of insulation that's on the pipe might be fiberglass, but you also look at the elbows, and a lot of times the elbows have a tendency to be a little bit grayer or almost blue, and when you cut into them, you'll see the same thing as you see with the mag. You'll see a powdery, dusty material, but there also are a number of fibers that run through this in a matrix that holds it together. And typically this matrix of fibrous materials is a form of asbestos, usually chrysotile, but it also can be amosite. But when you have a fitting that is of this color, this bluish gray color, it almost always is known to contain asbestos. Can't tell about any of these materials without having them tested, but as a general rule, when you're walking through and looking in areas, if you have this information in the back of your hand, in the back of your mind, excuse me, you'll be less likely to do something inadvertent and causing a problem where a problem didn't exist. Let's change gears for just a minute now and talk a little bit about definitions. In dealing with all of this science of asbestos, the rules, the terminologies, one of the things that makes a substantial difference in the way that you look at some of these things is understanding the definitions. So I've got a couple of definitions that I want to talk about here. Some of the terms that I've already used, which probably should have talked about them a little bit earlier, but at least we'll get them in front of you so that you'll have an understanding of a little bit about what we're talking about from this point forward. You hear a lot of times the term ACM. That is a term that means an asbestos-containing material. You'll find that in most of the regulations that we're going to discuss a little bit further along. And what an asbestos-containing material by definition is a material that contains more than 1% by weight of asbestos. So you can have an asbestos-containing material with a material that's 1.5%. You can have a small amount of asbestos in a material. If it's less than 1%, then it actually is not considered by definition an asbestos-containing material. Sort of along the same lines, but consistent with the rule that governs asbestos in schools, is a term that is called ACBM. ACBM stands for asbestos-containing building materials. ACBM is a subset of all the ACMs that there are. We'll find that when we're talking about AHERA and the asbestos in school rules, that the only thing that that rule addresses are certain types of asbestos materials that are found inside the school. So regulated materials under AHERA are known as ACBM, or asbestos-containing building materials. There's another term that you need to understand. It's called PACM, or presumed asbestos-containing materials. You'll find as we walk through the regulations that the rules don't necessarily require that you identify all of the materials that are in your building or your facility, but they require you to presume that a material is asbestos if you don't actually sample it to identify. And if you presume that a material is asbestos, then you have to handle it, manage it in a way as if it were asbestos. But PACM means presumed asbestos-containing material. One of the most important terms that that is involved in dealing with asbestos and its potential to have adverse health effects on people is a term that is called friable. And I'd like for you to think about that term and try to burn that into the back of your mind if you could, because whether or not an asbestos material is friable is very important from a number of different ways, including what the potential health effects of its presence in an area are, whether it's a regulated material, what it is that you need to do with it. The EPA has a definition of friable which says material that is able to be pulverized to a powder using normal hand pressure. However, when different regulatory agencies actually use that term friable from a regulatory perspective, I think a more applicable definition is a material that has the potential to become airborne and or release fibers into the air. A lot of materials that you couldn't normally crumble into powder with hand pressure can be considered friable by a number of regulatory agencies. For example, floor tiles, asphalt floor tiles, asbestos mastics that are solid glues, roofing felts and materials that you would have a really hard time because either of the physical strength of the material or the bound and interwoven properties of the glue releasing asbestos into a powder, but at the same time, if it has its potential to release fibers into the air during the handling of it, a lot of regulatory agencies will consider it a friable material. With this information in mind, I'd like to talk our way through a little bit about the potential adverse health effects associated with exposure to asbestos. And before we do that, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about